I'm not a philosopher, I'm a sociologist and a lawyer. So I started transferring some of these ideas into contexts I could kind of make sense of, if you like. And your prehistory and hyperhistory are the two areas which kind of fascinate me in a way, because they encapsulate a lot of what goes on in law. And the reason I say this is, one of the first questions that law students are sometimes set is one of the most futile, which is, what is law? And it's a very deceptive question, because nobody can answer it, nobody's ever answered it, and nobody will answer it, but it kind of sets them off on a chase where they come up with various things and so on. And, but nonetheless, it leaves a kind of residue in people's minds, as though there is something there which you can capture conceptually in some way, the law, whatever it is, and so on. And it really is quite deceptive. And so this is where I find myself sort of stepping into the sociological shoes, because when you look at acephalous societies, ones without a head, a leader or a state or something like that, you still see law-like things happening. It's not like people are in total chaos or anarchy or what have you. They're quite ordered societies, and they do it without norms being directed from on high. It's not as if any particular constituent part of that society has the monopoly of violence, which is the classic Weberian way of describing law and the state. In a way, these are non-states, unstates, which somehow function in a very often tolerant, just way. Not always, but there are things there. And yes, at the same time, they are replete with certainty, because often history isn't recorded in the way that you have been mentioning. But a lot of oral traditions and customs and so forth. It doesn't mean it's unchanging, it changes, but you have a sense of justice which doesn't build on precedent and development and logical sequences, but more ad hoc, cardy type justice, as it's sometimes described. But nonetheless, the societies function very, very efficiently. You could say, in a way, that the degree of uncertainty in those societies is quite low, because they often depend on magic, symbols and things like this, and not other forms. It's almost as though when we move into modernity or hyperhistory, if you like, we are increasing the uncertainty, because also, in a way, we've moved away from magic, although it's surprising how much magic and symbolism still remains in law. But we've moved away from magic into science. And the more scientific we have become in some ways, the more uncertain about the world we've become, because we know we don't have all the answers. We can never have all the answers. So we become very addicted to asking questions and more questions and so on. As you know, using the metaphor, pushing the boundaries of knowledge, pushing the boundaries of the questions, if you like. And so in a way, we've always been, I think, replete with uncertainty. It's just that we don't articulate it very clearly to ourselves. So if we look at the role of professionals, for example, professionals are people, whether it's doctors, lawyers, accountants, whatever, who deal with people's problems, if you like. So somebody comes and says, I have a problem, I'm ill. I've just killed somebody. I killed Alice, or whatever. I had an HSBC account, and what do I do? Whatever it is like this, and in a way, then the professional does a combination of things, which is part magic and part scientific. You lay hands on the person, either literally or figuratively, and you assure them, I can deal with this, don't worry, in some way. You reduce uncertainty. You reduce their uncertainty while you increase yours, which is, what the hell is this problem about, and how do I deal with it? And the anthropologist Renee Fox talked about trying to train doctors for uncertainty and how difficult this was, because at a certain stage, uncertainty becomes too uncertain, too troubling, too traumatic, and you refuse to accept it anymore. You say, it doesn't really exist. I'm going to override it. In a way, what you're saying is, I'm not going to ask the questions that lead to uncertainty. I'm going to deny these questions even exist in some ways. And it's a kind of perverse power which doesn't celebrate the questions, but denies the questions. And of course, then this leads to all kinds of anomalies and difficulties when mistakes start occurring. How do you account for mistakes? Some are easy. The scalpel's in there, somebody left it in there. But, you know, if somebody's illness doesn't get completely cured, is that because they didn't get the right kind of medications, it was incurable, or what? It becomes much harder to determine there. And the role of questions becomes even more, in a sense, forensic in trying to find out the solutions. But we never get to the final answers in this way. So, yes, uncertainty, in a sense, is endemic, is intrinsic to our way of being, I think, in this respect. And I really do, you know, I agree with what you're saying, and I really like the way you put it, because I think what you managed to do is strip out a lot of the fripperies around this and get to the core. But I think when we look at it, if you like, sociologically and so on, we see, yes, this is the way actually people behave. This is the way networks function and so forth. What I want to throw into this part, and you know, I think we can actually see it in a sort of post-Westphalian society. I mean, as I was thinking as you were talking about that, and I'll wind up here, you know, you mentioned universal rights, and we had this whole era when we had trust in these supranational institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, Bretton Woods, United Nations, UNESCO. I could go on and on and on. And then, you know, in a sense, the Bush era just collapsed all of that and said, it really doesn't matter. It's, you know, we're back to the old idea of the supremacy of the state. However, even while that was happening, all of it was being subverted and undermined by a whole series of negotiations going on. The World Trade Organization, the GATT negotiations, the GATS negotiations, and the one that's happening right now, TTIPs, which is about the US EU negotiations, all of which are held in secrecy. Quite undemocratic, quite, you know, and some information gets leaked now and then and so forth and what have you. And it's clear, you know, that the control of information here has been paramount to the successful adoption and use of power in a global way. But occasionally, of course, it's subverted by the use of things like social media and what have you. So you do get this kind of dispersive actions and this idea of distribution, which I do agree with what you're saying there. So the last bit I want to throw in to my pot, if you like, and you've mentioned this in other papers of yours, but you didn't mention it today, is what are we going to do about autonomous artificial agents, the robots, the artificial intelligence, and so on. So I go back to my medical example earlier. We know that, you know, if you have surgery on your eyes, even though it's programmed by a human, it's all done by machine now. We know that IBM's Wilson is being used for complex remote surgery across countries more and more. We're assigning more and more of our delicate, intricate work, which we thought was the role of humans to deliver, to machines. Machines which are learning as they are doing things and so on. Machines which themselves may have the potential to start asking questions, may have the potential to raise uncertainty about which we may be powerless to deal with if we don't have the appropriate communication strategies, ethical standards, and so forth. I'll stop there.
No, no. Well, I've spoken enough, please. I'll make some comments then. And thank you very much for a real wide talk, and it kind of kicked off a whole lot of ideas. So it's hard to know really where to start. But I might just take up this point of uncertainty, because I suppose in management studies, it's often more understood as ambiguity, which seems to be a kind of parallel, not quite the same concept, but very related. And I suppose particularly in the 60s, there was a lot of discussions about managing in ambiguity and managing in uncertain situations. And it struck me, I got a little email this morning. There's a TED Talk coming out, which is running an organization with no rules. And I haven't seen the TED Talk because I just got it today, but it did remind me of back in the 60s, and I suppose the person who was very central in terms of advancing this discussion about managing in ambiguity would have been James March, who's Dean of the School of Social Sciences in Irvine in the 60s. And he actually conducted an experiment, I suppose, in terms of the School of Social Sciences, in that he didn't want rules. And he came up with the concept of organized anarchy, and it was tremendously influential on people like Mintzberg and Tom Peters, and the way in which organizations could happen. You can kind of have an organized anarchy, a world without rules. And in many ways, he was reflecting on universities as well, as universities being kind of organized anarchies, and it became a model for other organizations. But the curious thing from studying what was happening in Irvine in the 60s, and there was a lot of uncertainty, because let's not have any rules. The only rule was not to have rules. But you got a lot of pain in Irvine. And parallel to in Irvine at that time, there was a commune on campus, and there was a lot of, I suppose, hurt people in the commune. There was about 80 people in the commune, and there was a lot of communes in California in the 60s, and it's interesting to me that very few people have studied these communes, which are an attempt to create a world that has a lot of uncertainty. And to increase the uncertainty, because I don't know what's going to happen. Let's get rid of the rules. And there was a lot of intolerance in those worlds. So I'm not too sure. I'm not necessarily bought on the argument that you increase uncertainty and somehow you will get a more tolerant society, because like there's a reference to Rawls and to Kant. And both of them are dealing with thought experiments. So you have a thought experiment about the absence of knowledge. Like Rawls' veil of ignorance is a thought experiment. And Kant also works with thought experiments. And thought experiments are thought experiments, but transferring a thought experiment into the real world. There's the word that came up a few times was this pinch. We have a pinch of uncertainty. But how much is pinch? What's a pinch? And a pinch has a number of meanings, because a pinch is also can be painful. You can get a pinch and it can be quite painful. So a pinch is how do we ever know? Where is the line that we? So I'm not sure with the analogy with inflation, and there's an assumption at the moment that 3% of inflation is correct, but or cholesterol. So I'm not really bought on some of the analogies with uncertainty. But there is a fascinating set of. I probably would have liked more as well on violence and the monopoly of violence, because it's part of the reason the state, and it's interesting with Ukraine, and there's talk about the states giving arms. So it's not just things; it's things that could do real damage to you. It's the monopoly of violence that the state has. And what is becoming quite interesting is in this context where the state is losing, or is finding it's very difficult to operationalize its monopoly on violence, but also in terms of information, because I suppose statistics as a term it's the state getting information, the state information. And this idea of the state as the information gatherer is becoming really problematized. I know some of us are here, we're interested in the Bitcoin phenomena, and Bitcoin, interestingly, is the idea is that you have a world where really there is no state, and there is no state with a monopoly of violence, but it's still a state where people don't trust, or still a context or a community where people are mistrustful of one another, which I suppose, like Hobbes, which around the same time in the mid-17th century, is coming up with the idea of the Leviathan, which is the state that will take this violence, and will appropriate the violence and be able to control people. But there are potentially alternative models which are displacing the state. And Bitcoin then is an interesting phenomenon an interesting example of that, where the state may be sidelined, and there are implications then about how does violence manifest itself who starts appropriating violence in this world where the state is uneasy. So all of these things were coming, and probably a load more, but I've probably said more than enough. Niamh, I'll pass over to you.
I think I was so comforted when you said that you were going to show some ignorance, because I don't feel so bad about showing some of my own now. What struck me in everything that you said, and I've read the papers, and for me I've always felt that the way that you understand information and the way that I understand information are different, and I think that's because we're coming from different worlds. And I come from an IT or an IS background, an information systems background. And so when my first encounter with the notion of information was to do with Shannon's theory of information and the notion of information as entropy. And so before today, entropy is the idea that a less likely event has more information in it than a likely event. And that's how he looks at it. So the view is that the probability distribution of the events coupled with the information about the event forms a random variable whose average, i.e. expected value, is the average amount of information or entropy generated by the distribution. And the units of entropy are referred to as bits. So this was my first view of information. And for me then, information can't be put into boxes where Alice knows some things and doesn't know others, and there's a box around these things where all knowable things are in the box. And for me, information is more about probability and futurity and numbers of possible combinations in the future rather than some sort of quantifiable, substantial thing. And then later when I looked at information, it was to do with information versus data, how information differs from data. And information scholars, as much as we deride ourselves for doing this now, have spent a lot of time viewing information as something in a hierarchy where you've got data that can be assembled into meaning, which is called information, which is ultimately still somehow underneath knowledge, which you go back to just the notion of justifying true belief and what's justified and what's true and what's belief. We can go into those arguments, but those are the ways that IS people tend to think about information. And so for me, what's interesting then is information and uncertainty as being two sides, entropy as an interesting way of thinking about it, and then your ideas about you talk about the manifest and the latent, and that's something that I find quite interesting then, because then you start to think about information as what's latent in phenomena, what hasn't come to be yet but might, rather than this other sort of view, or potentiality. And then from that point of view, the notion of distributed cognition, distributed morality, distributed knowledge and information becomes very, very interesting, because the number of possible combinations of future latent things goes up. And so that's how I think about, and it's tough for me because I found the entire presentation so compelling, and I'm scribbling frantically notes because, this is really interesting, I get it now, I get what he's saying, but all the time I'm looking at what you're saying with my own views and definitions of these sorts of concepts. So I hear what you say and I love it, but it's very different from the way that I think about it. And I think that there's something fun there. And just the last thing I wanted to say then is, if we go back to the notion of information being related to possible future events and latency or potentiality that may or may not be realized, then the notions around big data and what's happening there in terms of predictive capability and the notion of precognition, because that's really what we're trying to do, becomes very interesting for me. So these are my thoughts.
And how many days do we have to discuss all this? I'm coming back. Amazing. Maybe I should start back from the last and then backward. So one reassurance is that all I've said today is 100% compatible, reversing compatible, as Michael will say, with Shannon. So a moment of advertisement. If you want to know more about this, you get it's very cheap, really very cheap, just a few pounds. Information, a very short introduction, and it's very short too. So what you find there, and I share your pain, is that unfortunately information has so many different meanings for so many different disciplines and people. Now, at some point you really feel like, oh, can we have a little map of where we stand here? Because I'm lost. Certainly I was. So as quickly as I can, there was a time when Shannon and Shannon onwards, basically what is better called as the mathematical theory of communication, was the only way of understanding information, and it was a good one. I mean, that's what we have it in the engineering department, in the statistical department, and so on. That's what makes things work. Now that, at least philosophers, for a moment thought, that's it, that's the solution. And then in a matter of maybe a decade or two, they realized that there was a fantastic constraint for anything you want to do. You have to work within that sort of framework, but it doesn't answer the questions you want to ask within that framework. The analogy here would be discussing tennis by saying, look, there's a lot of Newtonian physics here going on. Yes, there is. And don't even try to play tennis without taking into account the usual physics. But then, how do I win this game? Because knowing a lot of physics, that's not enough. So the necessary constraint is absolutely there, and I'm with you. That's what we mean by, for example, moving messages and so on. You toss a coin, and if it's a fair coin, never seen one, but ideally it's 50-50, so you have 1 out of 2, and it's 1 bit of information. If you have 2 coins, you got 4 alternatives, you won't go 2 bits, and so on. You can go all the way in terms of 2s and 8 and 16 and 32 and 64, and that's why, good old days we had those computers with those memories that now are laughable. It was 200 and something. So that's the constraint for any understanding of information today. Within that sort of big framework, you got other meanings of information that pile up. And I mentioned for a moment, there are at least 3. One is strictly directly related, which is the semantic or factual sense, the one I was talking about. Now that means that for any data being exchanged, now Shannon is very clear about this, the engineer doesn't care about truth, doesn't care about relevance, doesn't care about meaning. It's about probabilities. How many chances there are that the message sent here is going to get there, and how many points of uncertainty actually erases, basically. Well, that's the layer on which you start building the relevance, the meaning, the truth. So it's kind of accumulate on top of that, and you start talking about your breakfast, etc. But there's also another sense, which is not the factual, the semantic, but it's also the pattern out there in the world. When we say that the fingerprints or the rings of the tree, etc., are information, what we mean is that there's a pattern out there that, if properly exploited, can provide that Shannon-like sort of communication, which I can then interpret, etc., all the way down to that's the age of the tree. And then there's a third one, unfortunately, which is not just the semantic and factual, a story told about something else, the train timetable. It's not just the pattern out in the world. They're all related, by the way, but and they all sit on top of Shannon. And the third one is the procedural, the algorithmic. If I send you a particular piece of music, or I send you a piece of software, I've sent you some information. The thing is that it's not about the world, and it's not in the world as the sort of as a piece there, but it's for the world. That's the as something, for something, or about something. And that's the 3 categories that we normally use in terms of information. And when it is for something, that it's a recipe, it's an algorithm, it's a piece of music, is in order to deliver a particular product, say a particular word processor, or a cake, or particular sonata. So all this is terribly confusing, and I'm with you when you say, like, where are we on this map? I hope that I didn't contribute to the confusion. But basically, I was talking on top of Shannon of kind A, the semantic factual, as opposed to on top of Shannon, the algorithmic, or on top of Shannon, the patterns out there in the world. There's a lot of more to be said, but I think that I can connect your last point with the first point that you made about precognition and anticipatory understanding. And that's back to the artificial agents and AI, so we can start connecting some of the questions. There used to be just one major challenge that we dealt with when having AI around us, and that was about intelligence. You are exposed to something that can do something better than you, then you thought you were the only one. No, it used to be chess, now it's parking the car. It used to be surgery, but now no, I'd rather have the robot. And trust me, I'd rather have the robot landing the airplane than the pilot, who has to be kept kind of with the skills, and you go and you know that that's the pilot who has to land the aircraft every few times himself or herself, because otherwise he doesn't know how to do it anymore. But no, if it's smooth like satin, that's the computer. Thank you. You don't even notice. So we used to think that it was us, only us, better than anyone else, and we lost that sort of certainty. But the other thing that we also used to think it was uniquely human was freedom. And now, by the way, I don't believe, sorry, believe is not, I know, it's a bit stronger than I don't believe. I know that there's no AI, and I know that there's no AI you can think of in terms of our contemporary science. So anyone who says otherwise, that's science fiction. And is as intolerant as that. Don't believe a word. Don't believe the BBC, don't believe the newspapers, don't believe any cranky person. There is no such thing as AI as we can possibly understand today. So we don't even understand the human brain. But there's a lot of smart technology, really smart, that can do things better than us a lot of the times. And unfortunately, these smart technologies, they can also predict ourselves increasingly well. So these 2 points, intelligence as doing smart things, well, no, how about that gadget? And humanity as being free, what about that gadget knowing exactly what book you're going to order, what holiday you're going to like, that you are pregnant? Famous case, if you haven't been living on the moon, and so on. I mean, they know more and more about, quote unquote, about us than we can possibly imagine. So here the challenge is to re-understand the human, our philosophical anthropology, in terms of are more refined than just I'm the intelligent species on this planet, the only one that can act on information for smart tasks. Not true. And as the only species or agents or artifacts on this planet that can be free as in you would never guess. Oh yes, because freedom, unfortunately, if it is exercised rationally, is highly predictable. You always go back with the same toothpaste, always. In my case, I'm just astonished. I buy one more and I have that, and it's always that, and I don't even remember what it was. But I go to the price, the quality, what I like, then bingo, it's always the same. Disappointing in terms of my freedom of choice. But we don't have, for the philosophers among us, we don't have a philosophical anthropology that can do this today. Good old days, Friedman intelligence, that was enough. Today, we've been challenged. Don't believe a word, no, there's no artificial intelligence, but we need to re-understand ourselves much better in light of those machines. Now, I don't know how much time we have, but I want to touch at least one point of all the ones that have been made. Uncertainty as ambiguity. It is a difficulty, and it will be, I think it's fair to say, I'm happy to be told that if we understand uncertainty as ambiguity, then I think there's a completely different analysis to be developed. But I was trying to understand uncertainty as a very clear, deadly clear question to which you don't have the answer or any answer. So I wasn't talking about Schroeder, the physicist. I wasn't talking about a fuzzy picture of a very precise object. I was talking about a fuzzy object with a very sharp picture. A very sharp picture of a foggy day. That's the idea. Now, this is it's foggy. Well, that's because it's a foggy day, but it's a very, very sharp picture. So I'm trying to, I know that it can be ambiguous, the distinction, but the problem we have sometimes is that we have a fuzzy picture. We just have uncertainty as in confusion, ambiguity, like what's going on. That's not what I'm talking about. What I was talking about was, well, sometimes the situation has, say, no particular answer or has many answers, and you don't know exactly which answer, if any, is the good, right answer for your question. So the ambiguity is not, as it were, in the question, but is in the lack of the specific answer for that question. Now, it might seem a bit of philosophical, hair splitting, but here we have two different traditions, apparently, of analysis. One of the uncertainty, the other one of the ambiguity. Now, it is true that as today, I have no idea where the pinch, how much is a pinch. That is also a classic philosophical issue. And I would be already happy if we were to decide that a little bit, whatever the little bit is valuable, as opposed to none at all. So presented with the binary first question, yes, some or not at all, I'd be happy to say, well, yes, some uncertainty is good for society. The next question is, oh, what do you mean, but how much? I mean, it's like cholesterol. Oh, surely you need to have a particular threshold, above, below, or like inflation. Yes, but we have already answered the first question, that a little bit, some, a quantity of some kind is valuable. Then we have the next question, and I agree with you, and I don't have an answer for that. So how far do you want to push this uncertainty? But then I have the impression that there becomes really not a matter of having a nice theory, because it's not quantifiable stuff like in economics or in medicine. It's not sociology being a little bit more of a dirty job. But then we can do a per case. And when the government is now asking, this government, back home, the British government, back home, is asking, we want to have your data, your telephone data, because I need to have the information. I would like to say, no, that's the pinch of uncertainty you have to live with. That pinch of uncertainty, it's good for you, trust me. It's just the kind of pinch of uncertainty that I think it makes the whole system work more efficiently. So you see, at this point, we have shifted the problem from, privacy, no privacy, as in, no, it's the society as a whole that with that amount of questions asked but no answered, lives better. So in another context, a liberal society is a society in which any question can be asked, any, but not all of them need to be answered. You can ask me for whom I voted, by all means. It's a free world, but you're not supposed to know, and I'm not supposed to be forced to tell you. That's the difference between a democratic, liberal place and one that it isn't. So a place where Augustine, good old days, where there's total transparency because God sees everything, and you will be watched. And trust me, as a Catholic, growing up as a Catholic in Rome, you were being watched even when you were at the toilet. So big eye there, God's always checking. Well, that's a society where any question gets answered. Somewhere, somehow, there's a big brother or big God that has all the answers. Not the sort of society I was promoting today. So when God is in question, big government, that pinch. But I'm with you. So how much, where, when, case by case at the moment, a bit like cooking. It's a pinch of salt, like my mom would say. So, Mom, how much is a pinch of salt? So you will know when you taste it. There were many other things, but I'm looking at the...
Yeah, I think that,
yeah.
well, I mean, I'm happy that...
Not completely. That's why one thing, I'm with you entirely. That's why one of the things I said about transparency, for example. I mean, who is processing what, when, where, for what purpose? Well, that's just another way of saying who is asking which questions. And no, free to ask the questions, as long as sometimes there is a way of saying you're not going to get the answers. So sometimes the problem with Google is, but freedom of expression. Surely I'm free to ask. Oh, absolutely. The point is, you don't have the right to know. You have the right to ask. That's a completely different game. So in terms of, back to some homey practical stuff, about 20 years ago, the politicians lost a big train, which was the search world. They didn't understand. Brussels, they had no idea what was happening. And because, I said, everything happens so quickly and so fast, what is happening now is that they're trying to recapture or regain, no, go back on a train which has left a long time ago. Europe has left the whole search, and you can understand how keenly I feel about this, given this talk, the whole, as it were, business of uncertainty in the hands of private corporate agents. Fine. Well, I'm not from the moon. I like profit. The consequence is that the politician now feels disempowered, wants to regain the power politically through law. That's not the way of doing it. So if you see, the point that you are raising is crucial in a sort of very practical sense today, in terms of good business and good politics.
Any compelling questions from the audience? Seamus, another one there.
Thank you very much for the talk. I think the talk opens up an awful lot of interesting social questions. But I am kind of worried about the limits of the way you talk about information and the limits of your analytical strategy for opening up these questions more. And in some sense, I think you talk about information in a very alluring way. But I think the way you talk about information includes a lot of the complexities about the category of information, about what we mean by information and its relation to the social. So I'm wondering about your position on the relationship between information and the difficult philosophical category of truth. It's a lot of what you say strikes me as very much in kind of the correspondence type of mode. And so one of the things I'd like to see you problematize the category of information a little bit more, because and in some sense I think you're too close to Claude Shannon. I mean, Claude Shannon's stuff is very good for telecommunications and digital signal processing, but not very good for social analysis. And I think there's a big danger, especially of disembodying information and desituating information and removing it from the way that it's inevitably embedded in social practices. And when you start talking about the hyper, and when you start talking about the virtual, and when you start talking about the information age, I think there's a danger of fetishizing information in this kind of way, and focusing on this somehow idealistic or idealized domain of information. And in some sense, looked at that way, information is a pretty meaningless category, because I think one always has to think about information in practice. And one always has to think, and so there's a danger of focusing too much on so-called contemplative information, as it is constitutes some kind of truth, without due focus around the practices associated with the production, the consumption, and the politics of this, of information. So I would say that, your last point about the morphology of information flows is the morphology of uncertainty. I say, no, the morphology of uncertainty is the morphology of social practice in all its dynamic uncertainty. And I think fetishizing information in this kind of way is dangerous, because it rips it from this kind of mosaic of social practice, which is crucial to understanding that category.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty much on the same page. At the risk of self-advertisement, the first volume in the tetralogy, 4 volumes, is called The Philosophy of Information, and as Gianluca kindly mentioned. And there are several chapters, one of which deals with truth and information. Another chapter deals with what it means to have a justification for information. And another one on a network understanding, as in social practice, network of exchange and support for information. So I apologize for the self-advertisement, and it wasn't meant to, we didn't get this prepared in advance. But I'm so much with you that basically well, let me put it this way, I'm dealing with it. Having said, saying I've dealt with it sounds badly, so I'm engaged. Just to give you one small example, information is normally treated in terms of truth as there's a huge debate called the veridicality debate on information, and I'm on one side of it, together with other people, important people, where I argue that for something to be information, it has to be true. There's something called false information is like a false friend, someone who's not a friend, and false information just means not information. It doesn't mean something that is information and happens to be false. But of course, you know, from a general, more Shannon perspective, I mean, anything is information, whether it's true or false, but there's a difference here to be made between a context where you don't care about the truth value of information and a context where you start saying, look, this is semantic information, meaningful, has it to be true in order to do X and Y, Z. There's a huge amount of work to be done here. One of the things that you discover, especially from a Shannon perspective and probabilistic analysis, is that if you do some epistemic logic, which is a branch of model logic, which is a branch of logic which deals with this stuff, you realize that in the probabilities scenario, going back to part of the question, if something is informative, the more unlikely it is. Are you with me? No offense. What's the time today? Well, it's exactly the same time that it was yesterday at this time. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's definitely true, but not very informative because it's a tautology. Or more and more informative, it's 3 o'clock, or it's 3 and 2 minutes, and 3, 2 minutes and 5 seconds. The less likely, the more informative. Well, you got these two problems, for example, in terms of truth, and I end up with this truth reference. At the one end of the spectrum, you have the non-informativeness of tautologies, which is great as long as you don't realize that mathematics is reducible to logical tautologies, and therefore mathematics is totally non-informative. Yes, that's a sense, but that is called the scandal of deduction. Hintika and so on has been debated for over. You find more in the philosophy of information book. Or you can go to the opposite direction and say, well, the more unlikely something is, well, the more informative it is. Oh, and guess what? The most unlikely of all things is a contradiction. And that ends up by being the most informative thing you can ever have. Something that is always false is so unlikely to be never the case. And therefore, is the most informative. That's called the Bar-Hillel-Carnap paradox, and it's something else you find in the book. So, yes, truth, social practices, network theory, it has to be dealt with by the book.
Just to ask my question here, this historical example, just the reality of 1790s France, right? Tolerance of your own at that time was you believed in Catholicism, Protestant, Baptism, Methodist, Presbyterian, or Calvinist, right? But they all tolerate their own. You make excuses for your own, but you don't tolerate any other. There's no way you'll tolerate the other side, the other faction. But Voltaire came along, right, and he said, you must believe in supreme deity. So now tolerate all of all is required. So he asked that all Catholics, Protestants, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Calvinists tolerate each other, the supreme deity, and each other, right? But he made assume something. His false friend, something, right? He believed the supreme deity was benevolent. But the supreme deity could be malevolent. And you've got a different scenario altogether that people might be involved in. So is the past going to be replayed from historically every 500 years or so as we come along? Or in another philosophical concept, in objective physical reality, we have 4% of the universe is known, 96% is unknown. So we're actually dealing with a 96% uncertainty situation as we're in. How much more uncertainty do you want in the context that we have?
Yep. I think that's a great way of ending this lecture. How much uncertainty do we really want? Thank you very much. That's a wonderful way of ending it. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.